Have you ever heard the phrase repetition without repetition? No? So it is a phrase from Nikolai Bernstein on how he described training process. So what does it mean? Diba from the word itself, repetition without repetition. So you repeat something without actually repeating it. So it's kind of complicated, but for him, it serves as a reminder to prevent excessive repeated practice. Although repetitions are important because, diba, when we perform a skill or practice a skill, it needs repetition for us to be able to perform it properly, but it's not necessary to repeat the same movement pattern over and over again. Good day, everyone. Me and my group will be discussing the chapter 16, which is the practice variability and specificity. I am Rena Recare from BPED 2A, and I will be discussing the application, discussion, and the future performance benefit of practice variability. So let's go. After completing this chapter, students will be able to first explain the meaning of the term practice variability and its relation to predictions of theories of motor skill learning. Number 2, discuss ways to implement practice variability in skill learning or relating context. Relearning context. Number 3, describe how the contextual interference effect relates to organizing variable practice. 4, discuss the relevance of contextual interference as a basis of scheduling practice for novice learners and skilled performers. 5, identify the reasons why contextual interference benefits motor learning skill. And 6, describe the practice specificity hypothesis and contrast it with practice variability hypothesis. So variability of practice experiences is important for learning motor skills. So basically, this is the whole concept of this chapter, which is the chapter 16. So later on, we will discuss why practice variability is important in learning motor skill. So a primary reason a person practices a skill is to increase his or her capability of performing in a future situation that will require the skill. So, diba, before we do any skill, it needs practice, even the basic skills, because as saying says, practice makes perfect. But that doesn't mean that we have to make it perfect. That's why we practice it. But for us to be skilled enough, knowledgeable enough about that skill that anytime, anywhere, we can perform it correctly. For example, a basketball player needs to be successfully shooting free throws in the game. So in order to do so, he needs to be skilled enough. And one way to do it is to practice or train. Another example is a physical education students who will receive a grade based on the performance or skill test. So best example for this is related for this example is our activities in BPED 55, diba, which is to perform basic skills in different racket games. The badminton, lawn, and table tennis. So if you're like me na first time pa lang nakaka-perform ng ganitong mga games, and in order for me to have a high level of performance in this test, I need to practice. I need to condition myself I need to practice how to hold the racket properly, forehand and backhand, and how to serve, how to perform different shots. Because of this future performance requirement, teachers, coaches, athletic trainers, and therapists must design and establish practice conditions that will lead the greatest probability of successful performance in situations that will require the practice skills. So, as future educators, physical educators, trainers, or coach, even as students who need to perform a basic skills, we need to have or must create a design that is kanahaom sa atong conditions and situations, training designs. Because, for example, you are a trainer and you give a technique or method of training to do or training design to that skill for your athlete. but he is not performing at his best. Probably he's not comfortable of doing it, or his body cannot endure the training design that you have given. So we need to create a design that is best for our athlete or for us. No kanang comfortable ta, so we can observe ourselves or we can observe our athletes. What is their weaknesses? What are their situations? What are their strengths and abilities, skills, for us to be able to have our design nga haom sa tuha or haom sa ato ang athletes, because it will surely lead to a greatest and successful performance. So one practice characteristic that increase the chances for future performance success is the variability of the learner's experience while he or she practices. So this includes the variations of characteristics of the context in which the learner performs the skill, as well as the variations of skill he or she practicing. So because we already knows the different variations of skills and their characteristics, maka-adjust na dayon ta because we already experienced it. We have done a lot of errors. So we have done a lot of techniques and methods on how to perform it in our way nga sakto pud siya, but we are comfortable of performing it at our best. And that experiences, we could use it to perform better, adjust, as I have said earlier, maka-adjust, observe if saan tayo pinakanahirapan, pinakamadalian, and maka-create na tayo ng our own techniques and methods that we are comfortable, which is very successful in improving our learning of skill and for it to be successfully kanang performed. Now, next is the practitioner must address several important questions to determine how to optimize the types of and amounts of variations to be included in the practice experience. So, number one question is, what are the aspects of performing the skill? The skill, should he or she vary? Number two question is, how much variety of experiences is optimal? And number three is, how should the variety of experiences be organized in the practice sessions? So these are the very most important questions in determining how to optimize the types of amount of variations to be included in the practice experience. So let's proceed to the practice variability. So what is practice variability? So it refers to the variety of movements and context characteristics the learner experiences while practicing a skill. So from the word itself, variability. So it is the various skills and practice conditions we experience while we play. It is also continually changing, no? So, dili lang siya static or nag-focus ra ka sa usa ka skill or movement. By practicing several variations of motor tasks, one can effectively perform another motor task that shares structural similarities. So, in this, if you are already know the variation of that task, it is easy enough for you to perform another task that is similar to that task, because you already know the different practice variability of that, or you already perform different ways on how to practice that skill. Next is, these are the example theories of related to practice variability. One is the schematics in 1975, the schema theory, which is a key prediction that successful future performance of the skill depends on the amount of movement variability learner experience during the practice. So, on how successful your performance in the future will be, it depends on the amount of movement variability you experience during a practice. So that's what in the schema theory. And gentile learning stages of model emphasize the learner's need during practice to experience variations of regulatory and non-regulatory context characteristics. And the dynamical system views the skill stress the learners need to explore the perceptual motor workplace and to discover optimal solutions to the degrees of freedom problem posed by the skill. So these are three example theories related to practice variability. Next. The next is sorry. The next is the future performance benefit of practice variability. So an important benefit of learner derives from the practice experiences that promote movement and context variability is an increased capability to perform a skill in a future test situation. So like what I have said earlier, variability practice experiences increase capability to perform the skill, not just to perform the skill itself, but also to perform the skill in novel conditions like conditions or situations that is different, new to us, unexpected, or kanang unfamiliar events like competitive events, which we need to adjust in different situations. So our experiences and variability practices is very beneficial to these different situations. So when viewed from the perspective of transfer of learning, where the transfer of interest is the practice to the test, the inclusion of the movement and context variability in practice can be seen as a means of enhancing positive transfer from the practice to the test context. So variable practice versus constant practice. So variable, di ba, we already know what is variable practice. So it is a skill in a variety of ways or under varying conditions, while the constant practice involves practicing a skill under the same manner, condition each time it is performed. So constant practice is when we perform a skill, we do it in the same force, same manner, same pattern, same condition. So each time we performed it. So one of the way to establish that practice variability benefits future performance is to compare the effects of retention or transfer test performance for practice situations involving one variation of a skill, which is the constant practice, and those involving several variations of skill, which is the variable practice. So what is this retention and transfer test, no? So dito natin malalaman if the practice variability has its benefit for the future performance. So what is this is the difference of these two, no? So the retention test, so it is performed for a period of time after practice trials have ended. It is involved retesting people on the same task or condition, while the transfer test is the individual switching to different task conditions. So this type of comparison has been standard research strategy for testing schema theory hypothesis, which that the greater amount of variable practice lead to a better learning than lesser amount of practice. Kaya di ba, ang variable is you practice with different variations, different ways, so you practice more. While constant practice, you only practice a skill over and over again. So they believe that the greater amounts of variable practice you perform, the better learning you have than lesser amount of practice. So, in two experiments, Sia and Cole in 1990 to 1991 had participants learn to apply 175 Newton of force while pressing a handle. So these experiments has two groups, no? So the goal is to apply 175 Newton of force while pressing a handle. So there are two groups in this experiment, which is the constant practice group and the variable practice group. So the constant practice group practiced only the skill, which is performing the 175 Newton of force while pressing a handle, and with 289 trials, while the variable practice group practiced producing 4 different amounts of force, which is 125 Newton, 175, 150 Newton, 200 Newton, and 222 Newton. So as you have noticed that none of the amounts of force practiced by the variable practice group has 175, which is the goal of the experiment, right? So they only perform 120, 150, 200, and 225. But when both groups performed a retention and or transfer test for the 175 Newton, so the retention test was for the constant group, but the transfer test is for the variable group. The variable group performed more accurately than the constant group. So, why is that? Diba kaya ang constant group, diba sila ang nag-perform sa goal nga force, which is 175. Then the variable, they didn't even practice the exact amount of force. They only practice different force nga lapit sa 175. But they perform more accurately, no? So why is that? So it is because of the variability of practice experience. So, diba, because they perform different amount of force, which is 125, 150, 120 is, and 175, which is, if atong mabantayan is naa sa tunga-tunga ang 175. If they will be in a test, which is the retention test or transfer test, the variable group will perform the constant practice group in the variable practice group can perform the 175, and because diba ang constant group is na practice na gani nila ni for 289 trials, but the variable group perform it more accurately because they already know, or they have different knowledge of the different force. So, if ipa-perform sila og 125, kaya nila, and if ipa-perform sila ng 175, kaya nila because they can control the force, because they already know the different forces nga nakapalibot in that forces. So if ipa-perform sa kanila ang 175, kaya nila dahil kaya nga nila ang 125, 150, so nakaka-control na sila sa amount of force that they will give. While the constant practice group, they just know the one skill, which is the force of 175. So if the test is a transfer test, which is mag-change, what if they will change the force into 120? So constant group can't be able to perform the 120 because they just know the skill, which is the 175 only, but the variable practice group can perform the 120 because they know how to perform 125 or 120, so they can control the force, or they have the variety of knowledge about the different force. So I have to you get that point. Sorry. So the performance error benefit learning. So an apparent irony concerning the benefit of an increased amount of practice variability is that it is usually associated with an increased amount of performance error during a practice. So it is the kalakip ng increased amount of practice variability, which is the increased amount din ng performance error during a practice. However, this relationship is consistent with research evidence that shows more performance errors can be better than less error for skill learning when it occurs in the initial learning stage. So it is true no na when we perform a skill and we produce more errors, the more we learn the skill. Diba what if kanang what we have noticed when we perform a skill, no? So if we perform a skill with different errors, makaka-adjust na tayo sa mga different situations na dayon and different ways on how to perform a skill because we experience and we experience errors about it. So makaka-create tayo ng different techniques, different ways, different methods on how to perform it properly because we experience a lot of errors about it, and if a lot of errors, there is a lot of practice about it. So the best example is in the learning stage, no? When there are a lot of errors, the more learning we acquire. So it is the benefits of the errors. So the good example of this evidence is an experiment by Edwards and Lee in 1985. So each participant had to learn to move his or her arm through specified pattern of 100 seconds. Participants in the prompt group engaged in practice designed to minimize the performance errors. So ang prompt group nag-create sila ng practice design to minimize their performance error, which is they move accordingly as they count, no? So they count and then they follow the movement. So ready, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, count on a tape. They would complete the movement in the criterion time. As this pattern na sinusunod nila na perform nila ang movement in criterion time. Each person also practiced it until he could do the 3 trials in a row correctly in 1,200 seconds. But those in the trial and error group were told the goal movement time and received knowledge for result about their timing error after each trial, no? So those in the trial and error group, no, so they practice with a lot of errors. They just give the goal movement time and then they receive knowledge about the timing and errors each trial they practice. Unlike sa prompt group nga, they minimize their errors, no? They have a pattern so that hindi na sila magka-error. But in trial and error group, it's okay to have errors as long as malalaman nila kung ano ang timing and they have knowledge about their movements. So the result indicated that the two groups performed similarly in the retention test, which is i-repeat lang ang movement. The two have similarly results, but the trial and error group performed more accurately in the transfer test, which is mag-change. When both groups have to move in different amount of time, which is 1,800 seconds, the trial and error group perform it more accurately because they already know how to timing, because they make a lot of errors. They already adjusted it. Unlike sa prompt group that they have the pattern in that exact second. So when the different time is na-change siya in different time, so hindi na nila mapapala yung pattern na ginawa nila sa 1,200 seconds. So that is the difference between the trial and error and minimal errors. So similar result had been also reported in physical rehabilitation settings. For example, when an acute stroke patient, when instructed by either a trial and error or errorless training method to put on a sack. Those who practice by trial and error perform better on the transfer test that involve a variation of practice task. No, so sa acute stroke patients din, ginamit din nila ang trial and error learning method, which is it is okay to have errors, and they practice putting a sack in different ways, in different varied ways. Siguro, if standing, they put a sack while standing, they put the sack while sitting on the different heights of chairs, no? Then, although the physical rehabilitation research literature presents some evidence that shows the benefits of instructional strategies that minimize the amount of performance errors by people with specific cognitive disorders, for a brief review of this research, so the effect of errorless learning strategies does not carry over a healthy populations, no? So, mas better pa rin ang kanang trial and error learning method because nang maa-apply ito ng mga patients, especially when they perform in different varied ways, because hindi sa lahat ng panahon na-perform natin ang isang skill sa iba't ibang situations, no? We need to adjust. So, a trial and error and variation of practice task, no, in different ways. So, nakakatulong talaga ito for the patient to adjust in different situations, not just to focus on just one technique or one method. So, that's all for my report. Thank you for listening. So, the next report will be reported by my other teammate. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am Louie Dela Cerna, and the title of my topic is Implementing Practice Variety. And implementing practice variety is an important instruction planning decision in determining how to provide practice variety during practice session for learning skills. The first step is making this decision is to assess the characteristic of the future situation which is the learner will perform as skills. This is important that before you make a practice, you have a plan to what is your need to improve. If as a coach, you need to see what is you need to improve on that player. For example, there's a table of this. For example, the practice and test schedule. For free test, in this day you need to perform 40 free throws and 20 sets of 2 shots. And the second is the second practice is 40 free throws per day blocks or 10 shots. That's why you need to set your time or schedule of what you need to improve on that day and find what is the improvement of the player. That's why you need to make planning to that a plan that on the first day you need to free throw on that line, and the second day you need to you have an improvement to practice the basic skills of the students or a player. And you see the result if there is the improvement of the student, the improvement of the players of his practice. The verifying practice context. It's important to keep in mind that when people perform skill, they do in the context that have identifiable characteristics as we discussed in Chapter 1 and proposed by Gentle 2000. Movement must directly conform to a specific feature of environment context which is called regulatory condition. whereas other future non-regulatory conditions have to influence or only the direct influence of movement's characteristic. For example, if this is some regulatory condition that influence a person walking behavior are different when you walk on a concrete sidewalk than when you walk in the ice on the sand. This is an example. For example, the player is you having difference if you walk in, an example is this, in when you walk in a road, then you know that road is only plain and no barriers. But if you can walk in the ice or in the sun, is there is something that can be meron siyang bagong kung sa katawan niya, kasi iba kasi yung maglakad ka doon sa walang barrier sa doon sa ice, kasi yung ice you need a balance, kasi if you cannot balance is baka madulas. In the sand naman is pag maglalakad ka sa sand is you need to force your feet, kasi lulubog yun sa sand. Kaya this is you need kasi importante talaga to nga importante siya para makuan yung katawan mo, mabago bitaw yung mabago yung mayroong bagong matutunan yung katawan mo, kasi iba yung maglakad lang ka sa walang kasi iba yung maglakad lang sa kanang simple lang kaysa sa doon sa katulad sa basketball. Sa basketball is sa court is takbo ka lang takbo, okay lang yun kasi is patag naman. Kasi if you trying to basketball in the sun, it's different because you cannot hindi mo yun mapatalbog yung bola kasi sun yun. And pag bumalik ka nandoon sa court, makita mo may changes yun sa physical ability mo, kasi parang mas gumaan yung katawan mo maglaro kasi nasanay ka dun sa sun. At next is verifying practice condition for closed skills. Already discussed in chapter 1. Closed skill can be subdivided into whether or not the skills involve interstitial variety, which concerns that regulatory condition remaining the same of the context trial, just as for shooting free throws in basketball, or different as a goal further step making decision about what the varying in the practice of the closed skills in determining whatever or not skills involve internal variety the regulatory condition in the last situation. This example is a variatory condition for closed skills. Ito yung sinabi ko kanina na closed skills is yun yung mayroong matutunan yung may bago kang kung sa katawan mo. Like for example, sa basketball, first I talk about kanina kasi you play in the basketball, first you shot in the free throw, and the second day you shoot in the 3 points until you improvement of your shooting. That's why, and the other example is a golf. The first you shot in yung sa malapit lang, and then until nag-anam siya until na hanggang sa malayo na siya, ganyan, kasi marunong ka nang bumalance, ganyan bitaw. Marunong ka nang mo-balance yun sa may improvement sa katawan mo. Example if this close motor skills is verifying the correct regulatory condition by practicing on different climbing walls will increase a climber capacity to step to a new situation. Like this, as a climber, as a climber, diba? Nung una, yung akyat ka lang sa bundok, simple lang kasi hindi naman mahirap kasi may daan, ganyan. Pero as you climb is just a climber, or yung paakyat ka talaga na may stones, yung nagpa-practice ka kasi ma-develop yung hands, feet coordination mo, kasi it's difficult to climb na mahirap kasi yang gawin kasi ang hiniisip mo malalaglag ka ganyan, pero that's why kailangan ng mind, kailangan sa katawan, sa kamay, sa lahat ng parte ng katawan is mag-coordinate siya para magawa mo yun, para hindi ka mahulog. And that is makuha na yun, diyan mo matutunan that sa next activity is simple na lang gawin, kasi kaya ko nga yung climber na ang hirap nun, ganyan, umakyat ako ng ang hirap, kasi pag tumingin ka sa baba matatakot ka kasi malalaglag ka ganyan. Tapos maglalaro ka ng basketball, mas ma-feel mo na yung ang gaan ng katawan mo, ganyan, may changes sa physical. And next is, this is a table example of verifying practice condition for two types of close skills. The two types goals using is an iron. The goal is to succeed may shoot with the 7 iron during a golf match. Muna siya example sa close motor skills. Regulatory conditions that remain constant in match. And the second is a condition that can be where the far away distance repel shot, location, or a ball. And tingnan nyo, may changes siya, diba? In the first, ganyan ang ginawa niya. Then the second is ganito, ganyan. May changes na sa katawan niya. Sa basketball naman, the goal is a shoot to throw, succeed in the basketball games. Nag-shoot lang siya. Simply nga shoot, and regularly condition that remains constant in games. Basketball height, basketball distance from the throw line, basketball characteristic, and may changes na nga, ganyan, para iba-iba na yung ginagawa niya, para, yung sabi ko kanina, para ma-improve, para mas mabilis lang, magaan na yung katawan mo. If you practice, the condition should include a many non-curricular condition as possible to be similar to those that could be experienced in a game. Kasi pag maglalaro ka na, malaman mo yung maglaro ka ng ganito, iba-iba, kasi pag bating ng tunay na laro, magagamit mo talaga yun, kasi iba-iba na yung, kasi iba yung mga kalaban mo, yung kalaban mo is magaling ganyan, ikaw na nag-practice na is marunong ka na, ganito yung gawin ko, ganyan. And susunod is verifying practice condition for open skills. Each performance of an open skills is unique because in each performance of the skill, certain characteristics are new to performer. That is, a performance skills that person must produce certain movements that he or she has not made before and exactly the same manner situation requires. Open motor skills is yung gumawa siya ng other movements or mga nag-perform siya mga other things na hindi niya nagawa noon. Kasi for example, you have not tried to shot in the basketball in half court. That's why you practice until you succeed to shot the ball. Like Stephen Curry, he can shoot the ball in the half court, and he practice discover niya talaga yon sa self niya, nagpractice siya para pagdating ng panahon ma-develop yon, magaling ka na, hindi mo na kailangan pang hindi ako marunong mag-shoot, ganyan. Kaya ka may mag-practice learn new things para pagdating ng panahon alam mo na kung ano ang gagawin nun. And that's all my report. Thank you everyone, and do you have any follow-up question for me? Thank you for listening.
Good day everyone, I am Jeynith Arellano, and my topic is all about organizing variable practice. Experiencing practice variability benefits skill learning. It is important that we next consider how to organize organize the variable experiences within a practice session or unit of instruction. For example, suppose you are an elementary school physical education teacher, organizing a teaching unit on throwing for your classes. So as you can see in the table, a 6-day unit plan demonstrating 3 different practice structures. We have here in the left side, we have block, random, and serial. And 3 different throwing patterns. We have overhand, underhand, and sidearm. All classes are 30 minutes long, but the random practice and serial practice scheduled are divided into 5-minute segments. Each practice condition provide an equal amount of practice for each throwing pattern. To practice each throw in a random arrangement with 5 minutes blocks devoted to each particular pattern. So taga-adlaw ang student maka-experience og tag 6 ka 5 minutes blocks, which is dili sila parehas og outcomes. Sa third pattern, ang ila lang kaparehas is they practice all 3 an equal amount, which is the third arrangement serial practice involves 5 minutes blocks. So every day, ang mga student is they practice each pattern for 2 sets of 5 minutes every day in the same order, which is random practice and serial practice. So let's go to the contextual interference approach to organizing variable practice. According to William Batig, 1979, who first demonstrated this effect, contextual interference refers to interference, which is the memory and the performance disruption or na-interfere that results from performing multiple skills or variation of a skill within the context of practice. Practice schedule is organized will involve different amounts of contextual interference. A high amount of contextual interference occurs at one extreme. So, as you can see in the table, the amount of contextual interference that is possible in a practice situation is portrayed as a continuum ranging from high to low. Also presented are some sample variable practice schedules in terms of how each relates to the amount of contextual interference created by the schedule. So, at the opposite extreme, makita ninyo ang low amount of contextual interference that results from a schedule that organizes the practice of each task variation in its own block of time. And other schedules such as serial schedule fall along the continuum between these two extremes. Either naa siya sa high extreme and low extreme. For developing practice schedules associated with contextual interference, trials or ang time intervals kay dapat sakto or appropriate siya. So, let's go to the research evidence for the contextual interference effect. So, the first evidence of the contextual interference effect for motor skill learning was reported by Shia and Morgan in 1979. Results showed that the random practice schedule lead to poorer performance during practice, but a better performance on retention and transfer tests. So as you can see here, in amount of contextual interference, random practice has high amount. Therefore, ang bot pasabot sa research is that random practice ay nangunguna sa one of the poorer performance pag-abot sa practice. Pero pag-abot sa kaning contextual interference or retention, random practice has a better performance. evidence. The contextual interference effect outside of the laboratory. One of the first experiments that presented this type of evidence was reported by Goody and McGill on 1986. College women with no prior badminton experience practiced the short, long, and drive serves from the right service court. They practiced the serve 3 days a week for 3 weeks with 36 trials in each practice session for a total of 324 trials during the practice period. So in this study, the block practice group practice one serve each day of each week, while in the random practice group, they practice each serve randomly in every practice session. So I will show you the results from the experiment of Goody and McGill showing the effects of block and random practice. As you can see here, the vertical line is an accuracy scores and horizontal line is a retention transfer. Ang block practice is kanang square and then ang random practice is kanang circle. So as you can see, ang block practice is nag-una kaysa sa random practice. But pag-abot sa retention is nag-una na ang random practice. Dayon si block practice is ni-low or ni-ubos siya. Therefore, ang block practice is high in performance, but pag-abot sa retention is low na siya. While ang random practice is hina siya sa performance, pero pag-abot sa retention is high siya. Contextual interference influences judgments about learning. You saw some examples of situations in which performance during practice misrepresents the amount of learning occurring during practice. The conceptual interference effect is another example of this type of situation. Judgment about how much we are learning while we practice is referred to as metacognition, which concerns what we know about what we know. The assessment of this information is typically done by asking people to predict how will they think they will do on a retention test.
Judgments about how much people are learning during practice. An important study by Simon and Bjork on 2001 investigated how well people who are practicing multiple variations of a motor skill can assist their own learning during practice, which is commonly referred to as metacognition. The significance of their study is twofold. First, it was the first investigation of metacognition as it relates to the learning of motor skills. Second, it demonstrated that practicing multiple variations of a motor skill with a low amount of contextual interference influences learners to be overconfident about how well they will perform on an upcoming test. So let's go now to the Simon and Bjork on 2001 experiment. We have participants, 48 undergraduate university students. Motor skills practice. The task required participants to learn to press 3 specified 5K sequences on the number pad of a computer keyboard. So the sequences differed in the patterns of numbers to press and overall goal movement times or MT. So example, sequence 1 was the 95123 case with a 900 millisecond movement times goal. Sequence 2 was the 36584 case with a 1200 millisecond movement time goal. Sequence 3 was the 42589 case with a 1500 millisecond movement time goal. So in practice conditions, participants practice each sequence in a block or random order until they perform 30 successful trials for each sequence. Knowledge of result was provided after each trial in terms of A. Whether or not the correct case had been pressed, B. The actual movement times for the trial, and C. The number of milliseconds faster or slower the actual. So in block practice schedule, tanang trials sa sequence kay dapat ma-practice until the 30 trial criterion was achieved for the sequence. Sa random practice schedule naman is each sa ilahang tulo dapat ma-practice in a random order until the 30 trial criterion was achieved for each sequence. In assessment of participants' judgment of learning, at the end of every fifth successful trial, participants were asked to predict as closely as possible their estimate of how close they would come to the goal movement times. So, ipa-estimate sila or ipa-predict kung unsa sila ka-close sa goal movement times. Retention test. One day after completing the practice trials, participants performed a paper and pencil test of the recall of the K-press sequences and goal movement times. So as the results, we have block practice and random practice. The block practice is the triangle and the random practice is the square. So as you observe that the random practice is high siya pagabot sa performance, dayon high po siya pagabot sa retention test. Dayon ang block practice is murag na siya sa low siya pagabot sa performance, then low po siya pagabot sa retention test. So let's proceed to an application of the contextual interference effect to the physical therapy of stroke patients. A study by Hanlon 1996 demonstrated the benefit of a random practice schedule for the physical therapy of unilateral stroke patients who needed to rehabilitate the use of their hemiparetic, example, partially paralyzed arm to perform functional movement sequences. So the participants is 24 adult patients with chronic hemiparesis due to a unilateral cerebrovascular accident, which is commonly called a stroke. So movement sequence practice. Some participants use their hemiparetic arm to perform a 5-step sequence designed to approximate steps needed. So kaning hemiparetic arm is kaning na-paralyze niya nga kamot or kaning dili niya malihok. So mao ni siya yung gamiton para ma-train o dili na ma-paralyze or malihok-lihok bitaw yung kamot. Movement sequence practice are number 1, open a cupboard door. So for example is kaning cabinet, so i-open niya. Number 2 is grasp a coffee cup by the handle. So gunitan niya ang coffee cup sa kaning gunitanan niya. So number 3 is lift the cup off its shelf. So alusahon niya ang cup gikan sa iyahang butanganan. Number 4 is place the cup on the counter. So iyahang kaning ibutang ang cup sa lahi nga butanganan or kibali ibalhin niya og butang. 5 is release the grasp. So buhian niya ang cup gikan sa iyang paggunit. So in practice conditions, random practice schedule 10 trials in one session per day. until participants achieve the performance criterion of 3 consecutive correct trials. So between each trial of the movement sequence, participants perform 3 other tasks with a hemipiratic arm. So 1 is pointing, 2 touching a specified objects, 3 touching specified spots on a horizontal surface. Second is block practice schedule. 10 trials in 1 session per day until participants achieve their performance criterion of 3 consecutive correct trials. So, in retention test, dapat kay tanang participants is ma-perform nila ang 5-step movement sequence, which is katong open a cupboard door, grasp a coffee cup by the handle, lift the cup off its shelf, place the cup on the counter, and release the grasp.
Researchers have also proposed that several learner characteristics may limit the effect of contextual interference on skill learning. Age and skill level appear to be the most likely limiting factors. When participants in studies have been children, the highest amounts of contextual interference typically do not enhance learning. Landin and Solomon on 1996 found that low-skilled students in university tennis classes perform forehand and backhand strokes better on retention tests following block practice, whereas high-skilled students perform no differently following block or alternating trials practice schedules. So, ang high-skilled students is kabalo naman sila sa ilahang buhaton, das nanapod sila knowledge about how to play tennis. So, dili na sila kailangan pa nga mag-follow or na sila kaning alternating trials practice schedule kay na naman sila yung knowledge daan unless atong mga wala pa kabalo ng mga student mag-follow gid sila sa mga practice schedules. Guadagnoli and Ice in 2004 presented different but encouraging perspective, which is the challenge point. Refers to the implementation of specific practice conditions that will optimally challenge the person in a way that will enhance skill learning. Determining the challenge point involves a consideration of both the difficulty level of the skill being learned and the skill level of the learner. So there are 2 types of difficulty. First is nominal, which is a task-specific and inherent perceptual and motor requirements of the task. Second is functional. It is related to the skill level of the person. Hypothesis makes 2 predictions concerning the implementation of levels of contextual interference in practice schedule. First, we have random practice will be optimal for learning skills with the lowest level of difficulty, but less optimal for skills with the highest levels of difficulty. Second is for beginners or those with low skill levels, lower levels of contextual interference will be optimal, while higher levels of contextual interference will be effective for more skilled individual.
Implications for the practitioner. Given the inclusive nature of our present knowledge about the specific factors that limit the generalization of the effect of contextual interference in the skill learning, it is important to keep in mind that our present knowledge is different from the top and bottom portion of the continuum in this figure. In terms of the top half, we know that the moderate and high amount of contextual interference generally produce better learning skills variation than low amounts. However, the bottom half of the figure remains unresolved in terms of the amount of the contextual interference specific practice schedule produced when they are used for the learning specific skill variation. For the practitioner, when several variations of a skill must be learned, the best course of action is to select the practice schedule that would produce a moderate to high amount of contextual interference. But he or she should be prepared to moderate the schedule after practice begins in order to accommodate individuals who do not respond well in the practice schedule. So what is contextual interference? So contextual interference involves in mixing up your practice structure either by adding different tasks or adding practice variability when learning skills. This contextual interference effects shows that the interference effects the interference result in worse practice performance, but it gives a greater ability for you to retain and transfer skills as the later date. So, what is the contextual interference effect useful? So this effect as the counterintuitive as it tend to associate better practice performance with athletes learning more, whereas the contextual interference effects tells us that this may not always be the case. By adding in more practice variability, we challenge the athletes when they make more errors, but this seems to be create a longer lasting change in performance, or they may increase their learning bisan pa og we think it is or they make some errors while having their practice. So what is the contextual interference and the practice variability? So here is where both students and the coaches can get confused. There are two contendums along which we can add practice variability and the contextual interference into our practice. So historically, this small detail has been wala pa siya na-explain very well sa in literature. But the classic contextual inference effects involves adding in a new task to practice, and it is called the scale block to inter-random practice. So as you can see, in the illustration, we have the random practice, and the block practice on the lower part, the down corner, and then in the left we have this varied practice, and in the left side we have the constant practice. So the block practice from the bottom left corner, so would be the completing 20 throws in a row. This practice would be deemed to have no contextual interference. As we move up to the left side, we are adding the different task. An example would be 20 throws, throw-ins, 20 passes, and 20 sprints all carried out into the random order which is on the top side corner. This would be called the random practice and be considered to be the higher levels of the contextual interference. So the second scale seems as a moved left from the right across our grid from the constant to varied practice as we are being pedantic. We could call this adding practice variability, but constant interference studies seem to use this continuum for exploring the contextual interference effect. Because of the contextual interference effects, so it has been explained from the cognitive standpoint. Every sports take requires a level of understanding and planning. By mixing up tasks during the practice, but the athlete has to plan, forget, and replan each time. This is not required when carrying out the same task over and over again, which is the constant in the black practice. This theory is called the forgetting reconstruction hypothesis. It is a similar but slightly different theories is called the elaborative hypothesis, whereby mixing up tasks creates more distinctive memories between reps and induce better retention in our long-term working memory. So some studies have attempted to confirm these theories using um, electro electrosociology data. But this is some way to go before we properly understand the neutral workings behind the behavioral effects. The elaboration hypothesis. According to this theory, new skills learning can be sustained by two different kinds of processes: intra-task and inter-task. The intra-task processing involves the analysis of an individual task without reference to any information directly related either to another task being acquired, which could be a variant of the task in hand, or to other extant knowledge. In contrast, inter-task process aims to highlight through between task analysis the similarities and the differences between the task being acquired. Regarding to the contextual interference effect, the idea is that a block schedule requires only extra task a process, whereas the random schedule calls for both intra-task and inter-task processing. In the block schedule, only one task resides in working memory at a time, which explains the requirement of the extra task processing. On the other hand, in the random schedule, several tasks are present simultaneously in working memory, thanks to the possibility of identifying similarities and differences among the tasks. Inter-task processing allows to better NISIC representation than the block condition linked to inter-task processing. The action plan reconstruction hypothesis. Several authors have tried to account for the contextual interference effect by calling the reconstruction mechanism that takes place in the random practice condition. Their main idea is that the random practice requires more effortful processing in each trial. because the information related to the action plan for the current trial has been forgotten as a result of practicing the intervening movements. So, for each trial, the participants must reconstruct a new action before executing the next movement. For the block practice, in the other hand, the action plan that is appropriate for an upcoming trial is still active in working memory from the preceding trial. Thus, reconstructive activity in block practice can be minimized relative to random practice. According to the action plan reconstruction hypothesis, reconstructing the action plan at each trial generates a better ability to create appropriate response when the learner is confronted with a new transfer task, such as performing on its transfer task benefits from the learner's ability to create or reconstruct the new action plans.
Practice specificity for sensory perceptual characteristic, research by Preto and his colleague in Canada demonstrated that motor skill learning is specific to our sources of sensory or perceptual information available during practice. Their research has been on the role of vision and proprioception as the sensory perceptual information available during performance of a skill. Kumbaga, nag-focus sa pag-motivate or pagtanaw sa butang nga available sa pagtuon sa motor skills. Kung moingon ganitag visual sensory, mao na ang atong kakita through our eyes. If a person has a vision available during practice, vision remains an essential source of sensory information throughout the stages of learning. In fact, practice performance typically decreases when vision is not available during a retention or transfer test. In addition to those studies, a more recent one by Muradi, Muhavadi, and Salihi in 2014 found similar vision effects for learning a basketball free throw shooting skill. Diba, how can we practice free throw in basketball if we cannot see? That's why the need of vision and subsequent retention or transfer tasks also increase. So, vision is very need para sa to nga makatuon tag mga motor skills. Practice with vision influences people to prefer to use the same motor plan to perform the practice skill. See, it means that kung unsa ilang nakita during practice, gusto nila awaton ang pamaagi. Example, naay gatudlo og sayo tapos nakita atong gatanaw is tiyada kay siya musayo, that's why yan gisuon. Then, a different approach to the practice specificity effect of vision during learning involve that use of observational learning by Osman, Bird, and Hayes in 2005. Through visual sensory, we can observe sa mga butang or skills. Practice specificity for performance context characteristics. Recall that an important part of the performance context issue is the distinction between unintentional and incidental remembering. Unintentional remembering refers to when you must remember specified characteristic of an environmental context, whereas incidental remembering refers to the remembering of related but non-essential parts of the context. For example, you are practicing the return of a serve in tennis and you are told to estimate and report the ball speed for a serve. If you are then asked to report not only the ball speed but also the location in the service court where the ball landed, you will likely be able to report both. Even though you were not instructed to give attention to or remember the ball's landing location. In this example, reporting the ball speed represents intentional remembering. Reporting the ball's landing location represents incidental remembering. Research by David Wright and his colleague extended the performance context aspect of the encoding specificity principle to motor skills learning situation. Their research consistently demonstrated that Characteristic of a practice environmental context that are not parts of the actual skill to be learned also get learned. Rate and Shia, 1991 to 1994. In these experiments, participants typically learn 3 or 4-digit sequences of key presses on a computer keyboard. Participants saw specific sequences of the numerical keys displayed on the computer monitor as the intentional items they needed to learn. In addition, each sequence was color-coded, where created an association between a number sequence and its color. Participants were not told about the color coding feature, which means that color was an incidental part of the performance context. It was not a part of the skill that the participants were told to learn. However, their performance was better on the transfer test when they were shown both the number of sequence together with the association color coding than when they were shown the same number sequences with different colors. Research investigating performance context is that people learn more about the context that than they are explicitly instructed to learn. Parts of the environmental context in which a skill is practiced get included in what people learn. When these incidental parts of the context are available during a test, these serve as cues or aids to help retrieve the memory representation of the learned skill. Conversely, when these incidental environmental context features are not available during the test environment, performance is diminished. Examples of this effect include the use of mirrors in dance studios and weight training rooms. Because the mirrors are part of the practice environment, the visual feedback received from them becomes a part of what is learned. When the mirrors are not available, as would occur in a dance performance on a stage or in a weightlifting competition, performance of these activities will be poorer than it will be with the mirrors present. According to Sia and Wright in 1955, the decision of which specific skill to perform in a situation and the speed of its selection depend on the strength of the relationship between intentional and incidental features in the performance environment. The application for skill training is to include as many features of a test environmental context as possible in the practice environmental context. For example, if a goal of a gait training in physical therapy is for the patient to be able to walk in a crowded mall as a part of his or her daily living activities, then therapy sessions should include supervised walking in a crowded mall when the therapist determines that the patient can engage in this type of activity. In terms of its application to sports situation, the learning of the incidental parts of players, environmental context during practice, and competition leads to the home field advantage that is commonly observed in sports competition. This means that parts of the performance context in the home field are more familiar to the home team because they learn those parts when they practice in the context. Thus, they have learned important context cues that aid their performance even though they never practiced intentionally learning those cues. Practice specificity for cognitive processing characteristic according to the transfer appropriate processing theory. The type of practice that is best when a person is learning a skill requires the same type of cognitive processing activity that will be required in a transfer test, regardless of the physical similarity between the practice and test skills and situations. For example, if the test situation will require a rapid decision making, practice should consist of activities that require rapid decision making. A good example of this type of rapid decision-making situation is when a soccer player dribbles the ball down the field and sees that a defender will soon confront him or her. The player must decide very quickly whether to continue dribbling or to pass the ball to a teammate. One of the reasons for this relationship is that the cognitive processing that is a part of practice become a part of what is learned. As a result, The cognitive processing demands of a practice situation are a practice-specific aspect of skill learning. Relating the practice variability and specificity hypothesis. The practice variability hypothesis explains the retention and transfer benefit associated with practicing multiple variations of a skill. On the other hand, the practice specificity hypothesis explains why retention and transfer performance tend to be better when the practice and task contexts are similar relative to A. The sensory or perceptual information available, B. The environmental context in which the skill is performed, and C. Cognitive processing requirements. Also, it's worth noting that for many contextual interference studies, the higher contextual interference during practice was more similar to the text situation that was the lower contextual interference practice condition. This is not to say that the contextual interference affect a practice specificity effect, but there are situations in which the relationship between the practice and test condition are similar. So, special skills, a new phenomenon referred to as special skills, has added another dimension to our understanding of practice specificity and variability. The special skill effect was first demonstrated by Kitch, Schmidt, Lee, and Young 2005 in experiment in which skilled basketball players perform shoots at various distance from the basket. Kumbaga, ang special skills, igakakita na to ni sa mga great players in which makashoot sila in different distances, mapaduol man na or layo.